Let's talk about test-driven development best practices and work on an example. In this section, we will develop a simple feature using the test-driven development process. We will again use Python as the coding language. Do not worry if you're not familiar with Python. All we need to focus on here is the workflow and to understand the process. Before we dive into the actual example, let's take a moment to quickly go over some of the best practices to help us understand the workflow. The most important best practice in TDD is to keep each of the code units small. In Python and other object-oriented languages, this usually means the unit is a class, a module, or a group of related functions. By keeping the unit small, we could also have cleaner code as well as a self-documented test. We consider them self-documented because they're easy to read and to understand. It is also often helpful to keep a consistent test structure. They're usually in the way of setup, execution, validation, and then cleanup. The tests should also be run independently. There should not be any dependency on previous executed test cases or other test cases. There are also other best practices, such as using common setup and teardown for consistency, no dependency on system state, and so on. We could broadly separate the type of tests we will write and run into functional and non-functional testing. The functional testing includes tests that measures if the feature is working correctly. In other words, if the software is doing what we need it to do. The non-functional testing includes testing against the security, scalability, performance, government compliance, and so on. Under functional testing, we could also separate them into unit testing, which tests the function of a small piece of code, and integrated testing, which tests if the individual units work together as expected. In our example, let us pretend that we have been given the task of making sure all of our production systems are running the approved version of software. If breaking down the requirement, we could separate the test into writing functions to retrieve the software information by systems, such as Linux servers, Windows hosts, database hosts, and of course, networking gears. In our example, we will use Python's unit test module to test against an approved software version. So let's begin.